Transport, the movement of people and the goods which sustain their daily lives, is the lifeblood of the economy, and nowhere more so than in Britain. The pressures and innovations of the Industrial Revolution led to a transport revolution in the 19th century, with the development of canals, then railways, and around the end of the century, the invention of the motor vehicle with internal combustion engines. Some of the earliest powered road vehicles were used to carry goods rather than people. Road transport had the potential to be the wheels of industry. First steam, then petrol, and now diesel-powered vehicles have secured an irreplaceable position in the industrial supply chain. In Britain, 85% of all goods are moved by road. At the same time, public service vehicles carry millions of people every day, offering the ultimate in flexibility for business and leisure travel. Road goods and passenger vehicles hold the key to the future as they now enter their second century of progress.
This is Leyland the town, where buses, but particularly trucks, have been made by Leyland for the last 100 years. For most of the last 100 years, this has been a company town, and even today, it's a major centre of truck making in the United Kingdom.
Leyland Trucks has had an absolutely glorious past. I mean, to start here from small beginnings, making steam wagons in 1896, 100 years ago, it grew to dominate the world truck market, particularly during the 1940s, 1950s and into the 1960s. Most of the buses that carry people around the world have got something to do with Leyland in them. So in terms of real people carriers, this was the place where it all started.
Also in Leyland is the British Commercial Vehicle Museum. It houses the finest collection of historic commercial vehicles in Europe. And here we're able to trace Leyland motors from the very beginning, how Leyland trucks and buses began to dominate the world. So let's see how it all started. 100 years ago on this very site was formed a company which was destined to become one of the greatest names in the world commercial vehicle industry.
In 1896, Henry Spurrier and James Sumner formed the Lancashire Steam Motor Company here in Leyland. They completed work on a 1.5-ton capacity steam van only a few months after the 1896 Locomotives and Highways Act made such a vehicle a practical and legal proposition. And so began a century of commercial vehicle manufacture at Leyland.
Well, the person we refer to as Uncle Jim, James Sumner, was actually my mother's uncle. His sister Anne was my grandmother. I know that he was brought up at the smithy and that his father, Richard, he was shoeing horses, but he was already dabbling in light engineering as well. James lived there. Now, he took after his father in some respects in that he had a very inventive mind. Unfortunately, his father's inventive mind didn't always work very well. He didn't pursue his ideas, but James did. That was the big difference. He did experiments. He used to make his drawings on the hearthstone. I've seen this hearthstone, quite a big one, in front of the kitchen stove with a piece of chalk. And when I think, I worked in the drawing stores, which had nothing but a big long counter between us and the drawing office. When I looked at all those draftsmen with the drawing boards, and I thought, and Uncle Jim did it on the hearthstone, you know.
James Sumner had built a crude steam wagon back in 1884 in his grandfather's blacksmith shop. It was put to work hauling coal on a private track. He had made and marketed steam lawnmowers. Now the partnership with Spurrier led to the speedy development of successful steam-powered commercial vehicles.
I think Spurrier and Sumner were typical men of their period. Sumner was the original inquisitive engineer. Spurrier had done an engineering apprenticeship and he'd then gone to America with work for a railroad company there and came back full of enthusiasm. They were perhaps lucky in that they hadn't really dabbled in cars or tricycles to any extent. If you look at the history of motor manufacturers, quite a lot of them began making bicycles and went on to tricycles, motorised tricycles, then cars, and then maybe into vans, and then very slowly into commercial vehicles. Leyland came in feet first, if you like, at the heavy end. It saw a need for carrying large quantities.
In 1900, the first steam bus was built at Leyland for the Dundee Motor Omnibus Company. The following year, 3 steam mail vans were shipped to Ceylon. The 1903 Motor Car Act provided for the registration of vehicles and introduced a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. And by this time, the firm had delivered 39 vehicles and had a staff of 160. By the end of 1904, 72 vehicles had been produced, and the first experimental petrol engine vehicle, the Pig, was introduced. A bigger version of this vehicle, the Y-type, was offered as a 3, 4 or 5-ton truck and as a bus. In 1907, the
company was re-registered as Leyland Motors.
They were very prepared to take on anything that seemed sensible. They were, for instance, very early into engines for rail cars. In about 1910, among other things, they got a South African Railways rail car with a Leyland petrol engine on trial. And if you think that sort of 14 years before that they hadn't been building anything other than the odd steam lawnmower, it was really an incredibly quick jump.
By the outbreak of war in 1914, the company had 1,500 employees and had built over 2,000 petrol engine vehicles, in addition to steam wagons. Since 1912, the War Office had subsidized the purchase of certain vehicles in return for the right to commandeer them in the event of war. One type they standardized on was a 3-ton truck. With the outbreak of war, numerous fleets of these subsidized trucks were immediately recalled to Leyland to be stripped of civilian trimmings and equipped for war, to be delivered for use within a couple of days of the declaration of war itself. The whole of the Leyland output was allocated to the Royal Flying Corps, later the RAF. The Leyland 3-ton truck became commonly known as the RAF type.
I was 9 when the First World War broke out. Well, there was just Fishwick's buses and Leyland lorries going about, and the chassis and the tanks during the war. The chassis were going around testing, but my father and Captain Dodge did all the final testings on the tanks and the lorries before they went out to France, you see.
The First World War was very important to the development of petrol engine vehicles. Steamers had great disadvantages. They needed a constant supply of water and coal or coke, and their fires could be seen at night. The war also made an enormous difference to the company. It led to a growth in production and consequently in the workforce. Production rose from a handful of vehicles a week to a dozen or more a day. Over the course of the war, 6,000 RAF types were built for the military. Leyland started the war with 1,500 employees, and by the end of the war, it employed 2,800, and the expanded factory had trebled its output. But there was now an excess of trucks on the market. In 1919, the company bought back all the Leyland war stock that could be traced to try to bring some order to the marketplace.
It is this sort of vehicle that Leyland was buying back after the war, to try to get rid of the excess supply and to support the price in the truck market.
They purchased a government aircraft factory at Kingston to recondition the trucks. The reconditioning program continued until 1926, recovering over 3,000 vehicles. But this whole episode and the post-war slump in sales had taken Leyland to the verge of financial disaster.
There was also the problem that having bought or obtained another factory, you then had to keep it busy. So when the RAF type reconditioning scheme faded away, they looked around for other things, and they started, in fact, building a basic car called the Trojan, which they hadn't designed, but it was a very rugged sort of vehicle, solid tyres, a two-stroke four-cylinder engine under the floor, a fairly hard slogging, underperforming sort of vehicle that, however, was reliable, and they built that for some years. You could argue that Leyland has not been very lucky with cars. Their chief engineer after the First World War got very keen and produced this incredible Super Leyland car, which was perfection itself, beautifully quiet and powerful. It cost, I think, £7,000, which was probably double the price of a Rolls-Royce then. And I think they built either 14 or 16, according to which account you believe, before eventually deciding it wasn't a very good idea and it wasn't a very practical proposition. But they were also extremely venturesome. After the First World War, they set up in Australia and they set up in New Zealand, and they soon followed with agents or offices in India and premises in India and other countries. And possibly it was the recession here in the early 1920s which encouraged them to try and build up export business, partly because they got a factory which had been greatly enlarged and improved in the war, and partly because they got all these staff, and most of these staff came from the town of, or village of Leyland and all around. They had a paternal approach, if you like. They felt indebted to these people. It didn't cross their minds to lay them off in vast numbers, as would perhaps happen today. But at one time in 1923, I think they were working a 4-day fortnight. And that was when the company built up a deficit of almost £1 million, which was a huge amount of money in those days. The banks were not happy, but the banks didn't foreclose. But the banks did put a man in to oversee the business, a man by the name of Leyland. He became general manager. He apparently liked the business so much that he stayed on. And I think he reorganised it on fairly sensible lines, perhaps a little less dominated by the engineers.
The key vehicle to the development of Leyland was the Titan bus of 1927, the first acceptable double-decker with a drop frame for a reasonably low centre of gravity, a 6-cylinder engine, vacuum brakes and many other improvements. It was not a revolutionary vehicle, but evolutionary and very reliable. As was the competing AEC Regent, designed by the same man, Mr. G.J. Rackham. The Titan and its single-deck relation, the Tiger, combined the best of what could be done. It might have been said that the 4-cylinder engine was the engine for trucks and buses, and no one would query it. But the Titan bus came along with a 6-cylinder engine, and before long, most people with trucks and buses were going for 6 cylinders. Leyland was either shrewd in anticipating a trend or in setting the trend. Leyland was a very successful business in the 1930s, after record losses in the 1920s. They had dropped steam power altogether in 1926 and continued the changeover from petrol engines to diesel, then known as oil engines. They changed from solid to pneumatic tyres and developed the hydraulic torque converter, or fluid flywheel. It had a wide range of vehicles with a high level of technical innovation. Buses and coaches were a large percentage of the production, and yet there was an enormous variety of truck models in the 1930s as well. The big problem was that the railways were fighting for their commercial life, and road transport of all kinds expanded with great difficulty in this country. The early 1930s had seen restrictive legislation to curb the road transport industry, which had to prove need before gaining a license to move either goods or people. The railways were usually able to prove they could do the job as well, at least in theory, and so prevent licenses being granted. By the mid-1930s, in terms of durability and reliability, road transport made enormous strides, even though there was a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit for larger vehicles. The diesel engine had established its superiority, again for larger vehicles, and brakes, steering and suspension had all improved. Since the 1920s, Leyland had used animal names for many of its vehicles. Somebody realized that peculiar designations of letters and numbers didn't mean a lot to customers, as some manufacturers of cars find even today. And so there was the terrier, the bison, the buffalo, the bull, the hippo, the rhino, the cub, the lynx. And in buses there was the lion, the tiger, the cheetah, the gnu. Also, it must be said that one of Leyland's most famous lorries was named after a sea creature, the 8-wheeled Leyland octopus. Then there was another series of names for depots and distributors. And until the 1930s, customers didn't use the telephone very much. They ordered by telegram because it was cheaper. And there was a whole series of telegraphic names for models and component parts.
I actually joined Leyland in 1936, and I'd come from Preston Tech, and Leyland at that time was taking about 9 apprentices, and they were getting about 100 and odd people trying to get into Leyland. Almost everybody wore a Leyland badge, and they used to wear it day and night. I think we were paid 6 and 8 pence, and we had the apprentices strike. I think we got a further 10 pence, and I think everybody cycled to work. So the bus fare, I think, was 5 pence return, and you'd see as many as 3,000 cycles moving along the road towards Leyland. Leyland itself had massive cycle sheds with covers over and racks of cycles. At lunchtime, you weren't allowed to stay in the factory, and everybody was put out, irrespective of the weather. At finishing time, they lowered your top clothes back from the roof, and you got them 3 minutes before finishing time. And traditionally, you all hung your clothes on big racks, and they hoisted them up to the roof of the building. Obviously, the general view of the apprentices at that time was to join the Territorial Army, because the great threat of war was going on at the same time. So most of us were in the Territorial Army, almost without exception, the apprentices.
Modern infantry does almost as much riding as the cavalry used to do. And here are some of the trucks and lorries in the making, being assembled in factories to cope with the demands of the Ministry of Supply. Here's another famous factory building still more of those endless thousands. In this war, we've got the men and the materials too, right from the start. Now a tank factory, assembling the travelling fortresses that skip over the ground like goats and pour out a hail of lead as they go.
With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Leyland took on a new role. In spite of shortages, they produced 50 6-wheel retrievers a week for the army, in addition to a steady output of civilian vehicles. A new tank factory was soon in operation, and by 1941, Leyland had produced 500 Covenanter and 754 Churchill tanks. By 1943, Leyland was also responsible for the design of both the Centaur and Cromwell tanks.
Well, it made a wonderful product with a very high reputation amongst its customers. And there was, of course, a huge pent-up demand for trucks and buses around the world as of the end of a very long period of war in which most of the world had been starved of commercial vehicles. And that huge pent-up demand, Leyland was able to capitalize on very successfully. And it became quite quickly, I believe, the biggest exporter of heavy trucks in the world. The Comet was one of the new ones, as I remember it, still with a petrol engine in its early stages, and then with the 300 cubic inch diesel engine, which went on to become 350 375, 400 cubic inches, and was turbocharged as well. There was the 600 engine, and there were still a few of the old 7.4 litre engines being made. I joined the company as what they then called a student engineer apprentice at the Wellington House establishment, which Leyland had run for many years. And I spent 3 years there, working in pretty well every department of the company, usually for periods of 6 to 12 weeks and then moving on, earning the magnificent sum, if I remember, of 17.11 pence a week to start with, and finishing probably about 23 shillings a week. At Wellington House there would have been 20 or 30 people at any one time, a small intake each year, usually people who'd been at school until they were 17 or perhaps 18. It was a kind of alternative university.
I joined the company straight from school as an apprentice in early in 1948, and after doing the apprenticeship I did 2 years in the army and then came back as a design engineer and then went on to research. But my major activity with the company was an overseas field engineer and sales engineer, mainly in South America but also in Africa and various other parts of the world. I think certainly in the post-war decades, Leyland was probably a stronger bus manufacturer than it was a truck manufacturer. Although the trucks were of excellent quality, the numbers that were sold around the world never quite matched those of the buses. At a guess, I would say trucks were about a little more than a third of the export output, and buses accounted for the rest.
The huge production activity during the war provided the finance for a major investment program in equipment and new products post-war. Added to that was the tremendous excess demand for trucks and buses. The success of the Comet range began to change the balance between bus and truck production in Leyland. This was given further impetus when, in 1951, Leyland bought Albion, a very considerable manufacturer in its own right. In 1948, Leyland made 3,500 vehicles and Albion 2,000. Most of the Albion vehicles were trucks. Leyland went on to absorb such famous commercial vehicle names as Scammell, AEC, which also included Thornycroft, Guy, Daimlers, and many others. In addition, suppliers like West Yorkshire Foundries were also acquired. All part of a long-term plan to make Leyland one of the world's major vehicle firms.
With this world picture in mind, I went to the Leyland Motors plant in England. I first saw a distant view of Leyland's latest factory, the Spurrier Works, covering over 100 acres. It's set in open country about half a mile to the north of the rest of the Lancashire plant. As my eye turned southwards across the vast Farrington factory to a distant view of the older North and South Works, I remembered that these factories were only a part of the organization which is the Leyland Albion Scammell Group, an organization which employs nearly 1/3 of all those working in the British heavy commercial vehicles industry. A scale model showed me how this Lancashire plant had grown. In 1902, this was the whole of the Leyland works. By 1914, the factory had expanded to include all the present North Works. But these North Works alone were inadequate for the growing demand for vehicles from 1914 onwards. So, the South Works were built. At about this time, Leyland's built their own foundry, nearby at Farrington. And around this has been developed the Farrington factory on its 250-acre site. To the north of this lies the Spurrier Works, one of the most modern factories of its kind in Europe. Today, this one Lancashire plant alone, covering over 350 acres, employs some 12,000 men. Not surprising when you remember that Leyland's engineer the whole of their vehicles. They are the largest exporters of heavy-duty vehicles in the world.
There was an export boom. The government wanted the motor industry to spearhead its export drive, to earn the much-needed foreign exchange to pay for the post-war reconstruction of Britain. Leyland found a ready market for its trucks and buses in all parts of the world, and not just in the Commonwealth. This meant that Leyland built up a good marketing presence and also foreign-based manufacture, which reinforced its exports. Exports were a long-term phenomenon and more soundly based than those of the car makers, and the name of Leyland became synonymous with Britain's export drive.
All over the world these days, up-to-date public transport is a familiar sight. In the streets of Montevideo, in Uruguay, and further west in Buenos Aires in the Argentine. Modern diesel buses. Across the Pacific in Australia, there are diesel buses in Sydney. In India, too, in Delhi, these modern Western-designed diesel buses are being used to help tackle the passenger transport problem of that teeming city. In South Africa, the same type of transport can be seen taking workers out to the mines at Daveytown, Johannesburg. And I've seen these types of buses nearer home in several European towns and cities. As an Englishman, the red bus of London is as familiar to me as the Houses of Parliament or St. Paul's Cathedral. And in my world travels, I've noticed one thing in common to all these countries. Whether in London or Warsaw, in Holland or in Scotland, Australia, Asia, or South America, where there are buses made by Leyland. And throughout the world, it's not only the transport of passengers. There are goods, produce, heavy machinery, raw materials, being transported under all sorts of conditions. Speeding along the great highways which reach out from the industrial centers and helping to open up new territory, or blazing trails in remote places. In Western Australia, for instance, where Leyland hippos recently carried equipment for the new weather observatory up into the Rawlinson Range. Few white men have ever penetrated this wild country, let alone taken heavy mechanical transport across it.
I was asked would I like to go to Australia and manage the Leyland Australian operation, because I knew Australia, I'd been there during the war. Anyway, off I went with my family to Leyland Australia, which was based in Sydney at the time. But we just started a project to transfer the headquarters into a new plant, which had to be built yet, in Victoria. And we built a new assembly facility there, for trucks and buses, of course. And it was a very successful operation. It was pretty rare to risk the cost of a phone call. You usually sent cables to one another. Mail was taking 6-7 weeks. Whatever you did, you wrote and waited 6 weeks for it to arrive and 6 weeks for it to come back, you know. So generally, you ran the business, and if you didn't make a mistake, make a right mess of it, they left you alone. You had to take edicts from home, whether you liked them or not at times. But it was very much on your initiative, get on with it, you know.
First Leyland come into the fleet, into Nelly's fleet, about 1948-49. That was the first time, and continuously buying on since. Local company, we work with one another. There's always been a theory that if we can't get service from Leyland, where can we get it from? You know, people who you knew really, the spares was available, and we never even think of going to look anywhere else.
A new road is being built. To country lovers, a new scar on the green face of Britain. To industry and commerce, a new artery through which modern traffic can flow freely. Britain's transport must be kept moving. We can't afford to stand still on out-of-date roads.
The 1950s and 60s saw the emergence of British roads designed for high-speed travel, the sort of roads which had begun to appear on the continent and in America in the 1930s. Initially, this was felt to be to the benefit of all road vehicles, but unfortunately, it found British commercial vehicles wanting. By the mid-60s, with the increase in vehicle weights from 24 to 32 tons at the top, the increased speed limits that were allowed, and also the expansion of the motorways, it has found that trucks from the continent, long used to such conditions, were better for the task.
Motorways produced an enormous challenge not only to British manufacturers, but I think foreign manufacturers too. And Britain hadn't got a very developed road network in one sense, and that was a bit of a disadvantage for the home-based manufacturers because they didn't have the operational experience that, say, the Germans had with the Autobahn. Therefore, the first motorways over here were quite an experience, not merely for vehicle manufacturers, but for people like tyre manufacturers too. And if you think that the trucks went from a limit of 30 miles an hour to sort of practically no limit, this was an enormous change. Preston Bypass was certainly a useful experience for Leyland and for operators and vehicle manufacturers in general. Quite conveniently at hand, one might say.
Tight corners hold no worries for the driver of the new Beaver. This is more like driving a private car, in fact. Hardly any effort at all is required on the steering wheel. Even tight turns like this do not fatigue the driver. This is the type of truck every driver dreams about. Like its 6- and 8-wheeled stablemates, the Hippo and Octopus, the Beaver has easy access cab, power steering, power clutch and power handbrake, all as standard. The cab is available with steel or plastics panels, identical in finished appearance, but the plastic version weighs less and cannot rust. A modern vehicle leaving a modern factory. That sums up the Leyland way of life.
To open doors in those days, I think, was much more difficult than it is today, because to begin with, we were relatively unknown, but we soon made ourselves known. I think we had the secret of success, if you look back, a tremendous amount of authority was delegated. I mean, first of all, although there was air transport in those days, it wasn't as prolific as it is today, and there weren't faxes and computers and all that sort of thing. And I used to go overseas. I'd stay, a month, or, for instance, we did several big deals with Cuba, which have publicised very much, hundreds and hundreds of buses, and I very rarely spoke to anybody in the factory. You just did the deal and sorted it out, came back and said, look, that's what it is, I've got it, and this is the price, and these are deliveries, and these are the specifications, and now we've got to make them.
I did anything and everything that needed to be done in South America and parts of Africa as well. That included looking after the technical problems with the enormous amount of vehicles we had in those parts of the world at that time, and things like drawing up specs for new contracts, feeding technical information back to the research and development department so that the technical experience in the field could be built into the new product. As well as doing the Leyland work in Cuba, I taught heavy vehicle technology at Havana University, and our friend Mr. Castro was Chancellor of the university at that time, so I got to see him from time to time. And at the same time, Che Guevara was president of the National Bank, and I used to have to go and negotiate payments with Che Guevara when he was at the bank.
I took a Leyland Olympic bus with the Metro Camel body into the Middle East to see how we could get on with it. And through the contact we had out there, I got an introduction to the Shah of Persia to demonstrate this vehicle to him. And that photograph is me demonstrating that to him at his palace just north of Tehran. And with him is his chief of his own secret police force. And I can't remember, I think they bought 60 or 80 in the end of that vehicle. But he was driving it for well over half an hour, and we couldn't get him off it. He loved it.
This motor exhibition of commercial vehicles represents the progress in the British motor industry, and I think illustrates Great Britain's preeminent position as a manufacturer and supplier of trucks and buses throughout the world.
Leyland's grip on the market continued well into the 1970s. As late as 1979, Leyland was still Europe's largest bus and coach maker. The projections of demand for single-deck buses was very high, particularly with one-man operation. Double-deckers still then had to be two-man operated. Leyland was persuaded by the National Bus Company to design a standard bus in a limited number of forms and using unskilled labour. It was known as the Leyland National Bus and was built on a greenfield site in Cumberland.
The Leyland National. Comfortable, spacious, modern. A gentle, carefree journey. Simple, well-placed controls for one-man operation.
But the government subsequently changed the law to allow one-man double-deck buses, and that took away a lot of demand for the Leyland National. So, through no fault of its own, the vehicle never sold in the quantities that were envisaged.
Today's world runs on wheels, and British Leyland make more different kinds than anyone in the world. Leyland wheels carry London's millions to work every day. Leyland wheels claw their way up the Scottish Highlands, across the Sahara Desert, through the African jungle, the snows of Finland, the streets and highways of America, the crown colony of Hong Kong, and around the racetracks of the world. If it has wheels, the chances are that Leyland makes it. Leyland wheels on Leyland vehicles with Leyland engines create the widest range of transport systems ever available from one manufacturer.
The move which was to have the most far-reaching effects on the company was the acquisition of car makers. First Standard Triumph in 1961, then Rover, and finally and fatefully the effective takeover of British Motor Holdings, the makers of Austin, Morris, MG, Jaguar, and other car and CV marques. As a result, Leyland realized its ambition to become a giant automotive corporation, but car production was to involve massive investments and a disproportionate claim on senior management's attention at the expense of trucks and bus development, and to eventually bring about the collapse of the company. The addition of car makers did bring some benefits. Standard Triumph's experience with plastics was of tremendous value in developing the tilt cap. Rover's research with gas turbines led to them being tried in Leyland trucks for motorway trunking, but the gas turbine proved unsuited to the constant acceleration and deceleration. From 1975, considerable sums of money were invested in British Leyland. Of this, 350 million was devoted to the truck and bus side of the business. It seems a great deal of money. In fact, it wasn't enough. Because not only did Leyland need new ranges of trucks and buses, it needed new factories, it needed new engines, it needed new gearboxes. The money that was spent wisely, on introducing the T45 and subsequent ranges of trucks and buses. Unfortunately, it was spent at the wrong time. because the UK truck market in particular was about to go into free fall. Also, Leyland's traditional export markets, especially in the less developed countries, were undermined by the effects of the second oil crisis and the subsequent debt problems faced by the many nations and many underdeveloped nations. The period from the introduction of the T45 road train in 1979 to the takeover of Leyland by DAF in 1986 was a difficult one. Initially, there was a decline in the marketplace. Foreign markets collapsed. Also, the owner of British Leyland, effectively the British government, was following a policy of privatisation. It wanted to sell the state assets almost at any price. Leyland was for sale. And this didn't make for a stable commercial or operating environment. Eventually, the government did find a buyer, the Dutch company DAF. Now, however, following the financial demise of the new combine, Leyland is once again an independent British company, but closely linked through various joint schemes with other firms. For instance, Isuzu of Japan, but particularly DAF.
The DAF takeover, I think, came as somewhat of a surprise to people, as they were thought to be perhaps the obvious contender. And then when it went down again, I think people were very apprehensive about its future. But Leyland seems to be one of these firms that has been able to stage a comeback from terrible times. I think the assembly of Japanese trucks, purists may object to it, but I think it is the way the motor industry is developing, has developed, will develop. And I think even people in Leyland, if you like, are far-sighted enough to realise that a job is a job, and that if that's the way the industry is going, we might as well go with them, and we might as well do it before somebody else does it. And in a way, it's a compliment to them that they're assembled here and not in some other country or some other works.
I think it's a fantastic heritage to draw upon for the future. There's never a future, I think, without the past, and we have a tremendous skill base in this area, this terrific knowledge of trucks that's been born and bred through several generations of employees. The Leyland name is endemic with trucks right across the world, and it's a marvellous heritage to be proud of, to live up to, and to challenge the future with.
I suppose there's always been a Leyland, and it's not always led in terms of technical innovation, but it has tended to be successful because of its honest, hard, basic engineering. Reliable, if not flamboyant.
The Leyland assembly plant is one of the most modern in Europe. The tooling and the technology in this plant is second to none, and the important thing is that it's capable of turning out a zero-fault machine without an impossible financial burden on top of it, and that is very important in this day and age. The image of Leyland for most of its life has certainly been an image of enormous quality, very durable, well-designed, well-engineered vehicles. I think perhaps the main legacy that Leyland left in Europe was not so much the vehicles but the technology, because in the immediate post-war years, and in some cases pre-war, a lot of small but growing truck and bus companies in Europe came to Leyland for technical expertise. They bought technology and applied it to their own vehicles, and that is the real legacy that Leyland has left with the European truck and bus industry.
I think it had good technological development. I think it also had a superb sales organisation in its heyday. You know, we really did sell. We outsold against anybody. Practically every municipality in Europe at one stage had Leyland buses running in them. We sold hard and we sold strong and we succeeded. When the government came in and took over, I'm only an onlooker, I don't know what happened, but it looks to me as though they ran it by committees and certainly didn't place enough emphasis, to my way of thinking, on selling, because it's no use having wonderful organisations and committees and everything else unless you have people who can actually sell. As we expanded throughout the world, we realised we'd got to get bigger and better service organisations in all the countries we serviced. And selling 100 buses or 200 trucks or something was quite interesting, but it wasn't enough to build up a service organisation to really support it, and we felt that we ought to get something bigger, and we went into the car business, and Henry Spurrier had talks with Triumph, and we bought Standard Triumph to begin with. Thanks largely to Stanley Markland, he redeveloped some of the Standard Triumph car range. That developed quite successfully, but then the problems became even greater, and BMC, as it was then, was in dire straits, and the government used certain strong-arm techniques, as it were, to persuade us to merge with Leyland with BMC. And I think in retrospect that was a mistake, but on the other hand, I don't know that it would have altered the situation very much, because you look at the world today, there's only going to be about 5 car manufacturers in the world very shortly, so, and I don't think it would have changed it very much, but BMC was in a much worse state than we ever dreamed it was when we merged with it. Leyland was an old-fashioned company, the old school, the proper way of doing things. Ultimately, it was sensible enough at the 11th hour to modernise, to get into modern technology with new machine tools, computer-aided design, a new factory, and that is how it's been able to survive.
How would I sum up the importance of Leyland? Well, it pretty well started the commercial vehicle business in this country, and it's wonderful to see it's still here as one of the only British commercial vehicle companies left, and one that by all accounts is getting on as successfully today as it did in the early days.
So we've heard the story of Leyland's growth, Leyland's decline and then recovery. But this is what it's all about. A modern factory full of the best machinery with a well-motivated workforce, making products of a quality that are needed to compete in the world market. That's the story of Leyland trucks and buses. In the British Commercial Vehicle Museum, which houses the finest collection of historic commercial vehicles in Europe, you will see many of those Leyland vehicles. But you'll see many other vehicles made by a whole host of other British manufacturers. Manufacturers which together took the British commercial vehicle industry to world leadership.